All right, hello and welcome. Today we are diving deep, and I mean deep, into the very beginning of our nervous system. We're going to trace how a single layer of cells, the ectoderm, pulls off this absolutely remarkable transformation to lay down the entire blueprint for our brain and our spinal cord. So let's get right into it. So here's our game plan for today. We'll kick things off with a quick look at the embryonic period, just to get our bearings. Then we'll zoom in on the ectoderm itself. After that, we'll walk step by step through the amazing process of neurulation, and we'll meet some incredible cells called neural crest cells. And finally, we'll tie it all together by looking at why this matters clinically with neural tube defects. Okay, first things first. Let's set the stage. We're talking about weeks 3 through 8 of development. This is the embryonic period. And trust me, this is where all the action happens. It's when our fundamental body plan really gets laid out. This period is all about one word: organogenesis, the formation of organs. You see, those 3 primary germ layers that formed earlier, now it's their time to shine. You've got the endoderm, which forms the lining of your gut and lungs. You've got the mesoderm, building things like muscle and bone. And then you've got the star of our show today, the ectoderm, which is responsible for our skin and, you guessed it, the entire nervous system. By the end of this crazy 2-month window, pretty much all the major organ systems are in place, and the embryo is starting to look like a tiny human. So let's really zero in on that outer layer, the ectoderm. Now, sure, it makes our skin, which is obviously important, but it has a much, much more complex and frankly fascinating job to do, becoming our central nervous system. So how does this all get started? Well, it all kicks off with something called induction. Think of it like a conversation. You have the notochord and precordial mesoderm down in the middle layer, and they start sending out these molecular signals, basically shouting instructions up to the ectoderm that's sitting right on top of them. These signals tell a specific patch of that ectoderm, hey, you, time to change. And those cells listen. They thicken up and form what we call the neural plate. And these newly specialized cells, the ones in the neural plate, they get a new name, neuroectoderm. And you're going to want to remember that one. At this point, their fate is sealed. They have one job and one job only, to become the brain and spinal cord. This induction event is the official kickoff for the whole shebang, the process of neurulation. All right, on to the main event, neurulation. This is some serious cellular origami. It's the intricate mechanical process where that flat sheet of cells we just talked about is going to fold, bend, and fuse to create the hollow neural tube, which is the precursor to our entire central nervous system. So, it starts with the neural plate stretching out, getting longer. And as that happens, the sides, they start to lift up, kind of like the edges of a piece of paper you're starting to fold. These rising edges are called the neural folds. And right down the middle, between those 2 rising folds, you get this little valley, this depression. We call that the neural groove. Now, here's the key part. These folds, they don't just sit there. No way. They actively start moving toward each other, reaching across that groove until they touch. And then they fuse. But what's really cool is how it happens. It's not random. It starts right in the middle in what will be the neck region, and then it proceeds like a zipper, zipping up towards the head and zipping down towards the tail, both at the same time. And let me tell you, this whole thing happens fast. The timing is incredibly precise. The zippering begins right at the start of week 4. Then, around day 25, the opening at the head end, the anterior neuropore, closes up. Just 3 days later, boom, day 28, the opening at the tail end, the posterior neuropore seals shut. Okay, get your highlighters out because this timeline is classic high-yield exam material. And while this just shows you exactly what I'm talking about, look at this. On the left, we're at day 23. You can clearly see that big opening up top, right? That's the anterior neuropore. Now fast forward just 2 days. Look at the image on the right. Day 25, it's gone, completely closed. It's an absolutely stunning example of just how fast and precise all of this is. And with the closure of both of those ends, both neuropores, neurulation is officially done. We've made it. The central nervous system is now this self-contained, closed tube. The narrow part at the bottom, the caudal end, that's going to become the spinal cord. And the much broader part at the top, well, that's already starting to swell and form the early vesicles of the brain. But wait, there's more. While all of that zippering and folding was going on, something else, something pretty amazing was happening right at the edges of those folds. A very special group of cells emerged, the neural crest cells. So let's take a closer look at these guys. So right at the very tip, the crest of each neural fold, these unique cells basically decide, you know what, this tube life isn't for us.
They go through this profound transformation called an epithelial to mesenchymal transition, or EMT. It's a fancy way of saying they cut ties with their neighbors, change their shape, and become free agents. They detach and dive down into the embryo, setting off on these incredible journeys to all corners of the body.
And what do these little wanderers become? I mean, get ready, because this list is just mind-blowing. They form sensory ganglia for our cranial nerves. They become the C cells in the thyroid gland. They even help build the septum in the heart. Yeah, you heard that right. They also become the cells that make the dentin in our teeth, a lot of the skin on our face and neck, and all of our spinal ganglia. But we're not even done. They also form pretty much our entire sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic ganglia in our gut, and the core of our adrenal glands. They turn into Schwann cells that insulate our nerves, they contribute to the protective layers around our brain, and they become the melanocytes that give our skin its color. It's just the sheer variety is unbelievable. So you can see why this is so cool, right? Because they can travel all over the place and contribute to so many different tissues, from your face to your heart to your guts. These neural crest cells have earned a really cool nickname, the fourth germ layer. And honestly, they've absolutely earned it. It really drives home just how critical they are for development.
Okay, so now that we've seen how this beautiful, precise process is supposed to work, we can really start to appreciate what happens when it doesn't. And that brings us to the really important clinical side of things.
So let's just ask the big question. We've seen how that neural tube is supposed to zipper itself shut perfectly. But what's the fallout if that zipper gets stuck? What are the consequences when that process fails? Well, if that neural tube fails to close properly anywhere from the neck region on down, the condition that results is called spina bifida. Now, the severity can vary a ton depending on exactly where and how bad the closure defect is, but at its core, it is a direct result of that neurulation process we just walked through hitting a snag. Now, this right here, this is probably one of the most important things you'll take away from this. 400 micrograms. It's not just a number. Decades of research have shown, without a doubt, that daily supplementation with 400 micrograms of folic acid can prevent up to 70% of neural tube defects. That's not a small number. It's one of the biggest wins in all of public health. Okay, before we wrap this up, just a quick reminder. We've been super focused on the neuroectoderm and those amazing neurocrest cells. But let's not forget about the rest of the ectoderm. The part that didn't get those special instructions to become the neuroplate still has a really important job to do. And this final table just lays it all out perfectly. On the left, you've got the derivatives that come directly from the ectoderm, either the neural tube, giving us the central nervous system, or the surface ectoderm, giving us our skin, hair, and nails. Then, on the right, you've got that incredible list of things made by those adventurous travelers, the neural crestrels. This is an absolutely fantastic side for review, so you might want to screenshot this one. So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Think about those neural crest cells migrating everywhere, contributing to the heart, the face, the gut, the adrenal glands, all over the place. If something goes wrong with them, with their ability to form or migrate, what kind of problems would you expect to see? You wouldn't just see one little issue, right? You'd see this whole constellation of problems in seemingly unrelated parts of the body. It just really makes you appreciate how profoundly interconnected everything is, right from the very beginning. Thanks so much for joining me today.
All right, welcome back. In our last explainer, we started digging into the story of the mesoderm. Today, we're going to finish that story and see how this amazing middle layer builds everything from our muscles to our blood vessels. And then, we're going to watch one of the most incredible events in all of embryology. The moment our flat little embryo literally folds itself into a three-dimensional being. It's a wild story of transformation. So let's get right into it.
So here's our game plan for today. We'll kick things off by finishing up the mesoderm, looking at how it segments our body and builds our very first blood vessels. Then, we'll pull back for a big picture overview of everything the mesoderm becomes. From there, it's on to the main event, that dramatic process of embryonic folding. We'll see how this creates the gut tube, which is our perfect entry point to talk about the endoderm and what it makes. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with a super high-yield summary to make sure these key concepts are locked in for your exams. Let's do this.
Okay, first up, somite segmentation. Now this all has to do with the paraxial mesoderm. Remember those columns of tissue running right alongside the neural tube? Well, they don't stay as solid columns for long. They start to break up into these segmented blocks, and we call those blocks somites. You really want to think of these as the fundamental repeating building blocks for our body's entire segmented structure. At its peak, the embryo forms a whopping 42 to 44 pairs of these somites. But here's the really cool part.
not all of them stick around. Some of these early segments are kind of like temporary scaffolding. They form, they do their job, and then they disappear as development moves on. It's the super dynamic process of building up and then refining the final body plan.
And this whole process runs like clockwork. It all kicks off around day 20, when the very first pair of somites pops up in what's going to become the head, or the occipital region. From that point on, new somites are added in a super strict head-to-tail or craniocaudal sequence, and the rate is just remarkably consistent. About 3 new pairs form every single day until the end of that 5th week.
So where do all these somites end up? Well, let's take a little tour down the body axis. We get 4 pairs up in the occipital region, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, those are going to form the ribs, then 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and a final 8 to 10 pairs way down at the tail end in the coccygeal region. But like I mentioned, some of these are just temporary. That very first occipital pair and the last 5 to 7 coccygeal pairs, they eventually just regress and disappear. The rest, though, they're the foundation for our axial skeleton, our muscles, and the dermis of our back.
Now listen up, because this is a golden rule in embryology. You absolutely have to commit this to memory. So each somite gives us a myotome for muscle and a dermatome for skin. And here's the critical part. The nerve supply for that specific segment gets locked in really early, and it never changes. So even if those muscle cells migrate halfway across the developing body, they drag their original nerve supply right along with them. This is the entire anatomical basis for those dermatome maps you use constantly in neurology. It's a concept with huge clinical implications.
Okay, so we've seen how the body's segmented framework gets laid out. Now let's talk about its supply lines, its plumbing, if you will. Because it's not just about structure, the entire primordial circulatory system. We're talking the very first blood cells and blood vessels. It also comes from the mesoderm.
So how do we actually build these vessels? Well, it happens in 2 main ways. The first is called vasculogenesis. This is where vessels are built completely from scratch, or de novo, from these little clusters of mesodermal cells called blood islands. The second way is angiogenesis, and that's the process of sprouting new vessels from ones that have already been formed. So you can think of it this way. Vascular genesis builds the first highways, and then angiogenesis comes in and builds all the on-ramps and side streets.
And this diagram just illustrates that first process, vasculogenesis, perfectly. See, it all starts with these generic mesoderm cells, and with the right signals, they turn into a specialized cell type called a hemangioblast. These hemangioblasts then clump together to form what we call a blood island. Now look closely at the diagram. You can see how the cells on the outside of this island start to flatten out. They form the endothelial lining of a new primitive vessel. And at the same time, the cells on the inside differentiate into the very first blood cells. It's an incredibly efficient system for building a pipe and its contents all at once.
Okay, we've now covered the key developmental moves of the mesoderm. So before we move on to the next germ layer, let's just take a step back and connect all the dots. This is where we get to see the big picture of what this incredibly versatile layer is truly responsible for. So let's frame it with a simple question. After all this differentiation and all this cell migration, what are the final actual structures we see in a newborn that come from those 3 main subdivisions of the embryonic mesoderm?
Okay, let's unpack this flowchart piece by piece. We'll start with the paraxial mesoderm, from those somites we just talked about. This gives us the dermis of the skin, all the axial and limb muscles, and the axial skeleton, so your skull and your vertebral column. Next up, we've got the intermediate mesoderm. This one's pretty straightforward. It develops into the bulk of the urogenital system. So you're thinking kidneys, ureters, the adrenal cortex, and the gonads. And finally, we have the lateral plate mesoderm, which is a bit trickier because it splits into 2 different layers. The somatic or parietal layer forms the limb skeleton and the smooth linings of our body cavities, the pleura, pericardium, and peritoneum. Meanwhile, that splanchnic or visceral layer forms the visceral linings of those same cavities, plus the heart muscle, the smooth muscle of the gut wall, and all the blood cells and vessels. I mean, it's really the source of almost all of our body's in-between stuff. And now for a really dramatic shift in our story. We are moving from the middle layer to the innermost layer, the endoderm. But here's the thing. We can't really talk about the endoderm without talking about the mind-blowing process it drives, embryonic folding. This is a series of events that will take our flat, 3-layer disc and turn it into a recognizable, 3-dimensional body, all while creating our primitive gut tube. Seriously, this is where the magic really happens.
So this is our starting point, right at the beginning of the 4th week. The embryo is just a flat, 3-layer disc. You can see the ectoderm on top in blue, right next to the amniotic cavity. The mesoderm is sandwiched in the middle, and our endoderm, in yellow, is on the bottom, forming the roof of the yolk sac. It is, for all intents and purposes, a 3-layer pancake, just waiting for this huge transformation.
The first fold that happens is along the long axis, head to tail. We call this cephalocaudal folding. As you can see in the diagram, the head end and the tail end of the embryo curl downwards, ventrally. This motion scoops up a portion of that endoderm-lined yolk sac and tucks it inside the embryo. And this creates 2 little blind-ended tubes, the foregut up at the head end and the hindgut down at the tail end. And notice how this move also sweeps the developing heart tube down into what will become the chest. It's a complete reorganization of the embryo's geography. As that head-to-tail folding keeps going, we get a much more defined gut tube. The middle part, the midgut, stays connected to the yolk sac for a little while through this narrow stalk called the vitelline duct. And here's what's truly amazing. You can already see the little primordia, the beginnings of major organs budding right off this endodermal tube. Like the lung bud and the liver bud, the blueprints for our internal organs are already being laid down.
Now happening at the exact same time as this head-to-tail folding is a second, equally important fold, lateral folding. This is where the right and left sides of that embryonic disc start to sweep downwards and towards the middle, almost like you're closing a book. And this movement starts to pinch off the yolk sac and begins to enclose that primitive gut tube, right inside the developing body.
And here it is, the final result of all that folding. The lateral folds meet, and they fuse right along the ventral midline, completing the formation of a cylindrical body. We now have our fundamental tube-within-a-tube body plan. The outer tube is the body wall, from the ectoderm, and the inner tube is the gut, from the endoderm. And that space created between them, which is lined by mesoderm, is the intraembryonic body cavity, or coelom. That's where all our internal organs are going to end up. So, to quickly recap, this incredible process of folding achieves several absolutely critical things. 1, it creates the front body wall. 2, it forms the primitive gut. 3, it moves the developing heart and diaphragm into their correct positions. 4, it completely surrounds the embryo with the protective amniotic sac. And 5, it establishes our primary internal body cavity, the coelom. It is without a doubt the single biggest step in creating our fundamental body plan.
So now that we've formed that gut tube, let's really focus in on its lining, the endoderm. This single layer of cells is the source for the linings of our major internal tracts and also the functional tissue of several absolutely vital glands. This slide gives us a fantastic view of that primitive gut tube and all its derivatives. So let's take a look. You can see the tube itself is already specialized into the pharyngeal gut, the foregut, midgut, and hindgut. And look at all these little outgrowths. The tracheobronchial diverticulum, which is going to become the lungs, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. All of these vital structures start out as simple little buds growing off this primary endodermal tube. And here's your high-yield must-know list for endodermal derivatives. The main takeaway here is that endoderm primarily forms 2 things, epithelial linings and the functional parts, or parenchyma, of glands. So it gives rise to the entire epithelial lining of the GI tract, the respiratory tract, the urinary bladder and urethra, and even the middle ear cavity. And critically, it forms the crucial hormone and enzyme-producing cells of the thyroid, the parathyroids, the liver, and the pancreas.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a huge amount of ground today, from the segmentation of the mesoderm all the way to the dramatic folding of the embryo. So now let's bring it all together and focus on the most critical, high-yield concepts you need to take away. This is the stuff you'll need not just for your exams, but for your future clinical practice.
Okay, if you remember nothing else from today, burn these 5 points into your brain. Number 1, somite derivatives. Your myotomes and dermatomes, they keep their original nerve supply. This is clinical gold. 2, know the difference between vasculogenesis, that's building from scratch, and angiogenesis, which is just sprouting from existing vessels. 3, mesoderm is the everything in between layer. It forms all our muscle, connective tissue, and the cardiovascular and urogenital systems. 4, embryonic folding is the key event that turns our flat embryo into a 3D being and creates the gut. And 5, endoderm is the layer of linings and glands. Think GI and respiratory systems. If you master these 5, you have mastered the core of this topic.
And just for a final bit of advice for your exams, always think developmentally. For any organ or tissue you're studying, you should be able to trace it all the way back to its origin in the ectoderm, mesoderm, or endoderm. And second, please spend real time with the diagrams of embryonic folding. Truly understanding that dynamic transformation from a flat disc to a tube is an absolute game changer for understanding anatomy down the road.
Keep these points in mind, and you'll not only do great on your exams, but you'll also gain a much deeper appreciation for the just incredible process that builds a human being from just a few layers of cells.
All right, today we are diving into the fetal period. This is that incredible final stage of prenatal development. We're talking about the journey from week 9 all the way to birth, where the basic blueprint from the embryonic stage gets built out, grown, and perfected for life in the outside world.
So, here's our game plan. We'll start with the basics of what the fetal period even is. Then, we'll walk through the amazing changes month by month. We're going to pinpoint that crucial moment of viability, look at the final prep for birth, and wrap up with how doctors actually keep track of this whole process.
Okay, let's get right into it. To really get a handle on this stage, we have to lay some groundwork first. What exactly defines the fetal period? What are the key things that are happening? And how in the world do we measure all this amazing growth? To see the big picture, remember that human development has 3 main acts. First, you have the germinal stage, then the embryonic stage, which is where all the major organs first appear. Our focus today is on Act 3, the fetal period. This is the longest and, in many ways, the most dramatic part of the story, starting at week 9 and going right up to birth.
So, what's the big deal about week 9? What's the fundamental shift? Well, it's all about moving from formation to maturation. The embryonic period was like laying the foundation and framing the house. The fetal period, that's when we put in the plumbing, the wiring, the drywall, and everything else to make it a functional home. Tissues mature, organs get ready for their jobs, and the body just explodes in size.
Now, to track all this incredible growth, we use 2 main measurements. The first is crown rump length, or CRL. Just think of it as the sitting height. The second is crown heel length, or CHL, which is more like the full standing height. You'll hear these terms a lot, so it's good to get them straight now.
And check this out. This slide shows one of the wildest changes during this whole period, the body proportions. Early on, development is super top-heavy. At 3 months, the head is a full half of the fetus's entire length. It's wild. But by the time of birth, things have balanced out, and the head is only about a quarter of the total length. It's a perfect example of what we call differential growth.
Okay, on to our second section. Let's talk about the 3rd month, because this is a period of just massive, rapid-fire transformation. This is when the fetus really starts to look recognizably human.
The 3rd month is an absolute whirlwind of activity. The face starts to look way more human, the skeleton begins to harden, that's called ossification, starting in the long bones and the skull. Then, around week 12, we hit a huge milestone. The external genitalia are developed enough that you can actually tell the sex on an ultrasound. And inside, something fascinating happens. The intestinal loops, which were temporarily poking out into the umbilical cord, pull back into the abdomen. And maybe coolest of all, the fetus starts moving. The mother can't feel it yet, but those first little twitches are happening.
And here's what it all looks like. This is a fetus at 12 weeks. You can totally see the features we were just talking about. The head is still pretty big, yeah, but the face, the limbs, the whole overall structure, it's all there, wrapping up that first trimester.
Now we're entering the 2nd trimester, and this phase is really defined by 2 things: incredible growth spurts and developing all the systems to the point where survival outside the womb actually becomes possible. This is where we cross that all-important threshold of viability.
So during months 4 and 5, the big story is all about length. The fetus just shoots up, growing to about 15 centimeters in sitting height. But what's really interesting is that the weight gain hasn't caught up yet. It's still less than half a kilo. The body gets covered in this super fine, downy hair called lanugo. And for the mother, this is when a huge moment happens. She can finally feel the baby moving. We call that quickening.
This side-by-side comparison really just says it all, doesn't it? You can see that massive jump in size and just overall definition between month 4 and month 5. The arms and legs start to look more proportional, and the whole form is just way more defined. In the 6th month, the fetus has this very distinct look. Its skin is reddish and all wrinkled. And you might wonder why. Well, it's because it hasn't packed on that underlying connective tissue and fat yet. If a baby is born at this stage, survival is really tough, mainly because the respiratory and nervous systems just aren't mature enough to handle it.
But wow, a few weeks make a world of difference. And here is a number you absolutely have to know. Between 6.5 and 7 months, the odds of survival just skyrocket. A baby born at this point, weighing around 1,100 grams, has a 90% chance of making it. This is that critical viability threshold, and it's a huge deal in clinical practice.
So that brings us to the home stretch, the final trimester. The focus totally shifts now. It's less about getting longer and all about bulking up. This is the time for gaining weight, putting on fat, and making those final tweaks for life on the outside. Get this, in these last 2.5 months, the baby gains about half of its full-term weight. That's incredible. Subcutaneous fat gets laid down under the skin, which is what smooths out all those wrinkles and gives a newborn that classic chubby look. The skin also gets coated in this protective, whitish, cheesy stuff called vernix caseosa. And here's a key anatomical fact for delivery. The skull is now the biggest part of the body in terms of circumference. For boys, this is also when the testes make their final descent into the scrotum.
And this photo is a perfect illustration of that vernix caseosa. You can see it right there. Think of it like a natural, waterproof body lotion. It's secreted by the fetus's own glands, and it creates this barrier that protects the super delicate skin from being an amniotic fluid 24/7.
It's not just about physical growth, of course. All these new skills are coming online, and they follow a pretty clear timeline. Swallowing actually starts way back at 10 weeks. By weeks 14 to 16, the fetus is making practice breathing movements. Then at 24 weeks, those crucial sucking reflexes start, getting ready for feeding. Around that same time, the ears are developed enough to hear sounds, and by 28 weeks, the eyes can sense light. Okay, let's switch gears and put on our clinical hats. How do we take all this amazing biological knowledge and use it to help manage a pregnancy and keep the fetus healthy? Well, it all comes down to assessment, measuring growth, and spotting any potential problems.
Figuring out the due date is, of course, a huge part of prenatal care. The traditional way is to calculate it from the last normal menstrual period, or LNMP. But these days, for much better accuracy, we rely on ultrasound. In that first trimester, the crown rump length is the single best predictor of age. Later on, we use a combo of measurements, like the diameter of the skull, the circumference of the head and belly, and the length of the thigh bone.
Now, getting that dating right is absolutely vital, especially for spotting growth problems. And this is a super important clinical distinction you've got to nail down: the difference between intrauterine growth restriction, or IUGR, and being small for gestational age, or SGA. IUGR is a pathology. It means the fetus isn't reaching its genetic growth potential and is at risk. SGA, on the other hand, just means the baby is small, like in the bottom 10th percentile, but is otherwise perfectly healthy and growing just fine for its potential. The real challenge is telling them apart.
So what causes IUGR? Well, the list of potential culprits is pretty long. Some issues are with the fetus itself, like chromosomal problems or infections. A lot of factors can be maternal, like poor health or exposure to things like alcohol or drugs. And sometimes the problem lies with the placenta, if it's not delivering enough nutrients. Or it can just be a matter of multiple babies, like twins, competing for the same resources.
And the consequences of IUGR are really serious, both right after birth and way down the road. In the short term, these babies are at risk for things like neurological issues, malformations, and low blood sugar. But the effects can truly last a lifetime. We now know from long-term studies that these individuals have a higher chance of developing obesity, high blood pressure, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes when they're adults. And this really brings us full circle. Understanding this whole journey from that 9th week right up to birth isn't just a cool biology lesson. It's the absolute foundation of obstetrics and pediatrics. So the question I want to leave you with is this: how can we take this incredibly detailed knowledge of development, both normal and abnormal, and use it to make prenatal care even better, and ultimately to help reduce those long-term health risks for these vulnerable infants?
Today, we're diving into one of the most incredible stories in all of biology: how the placenta gets built. Seriously, it's a journey from just a few cells into this complex, temporary organ that is the absolute lifeline for a developing fetus. So how does this piece of biological magic actually happen? Let's get into it. Just take a look at this. On one side, you have the bumpy, fleshy maternal surface, and on the other, the smooth, shiny fetal surface, with blood vessels branching out like a tree. What's wild is that this single organ is a masterpiece of teamwork built by two genetically different individuals. So how in the world does this structure form? How does it create that perfect connection between mother and child? That's exactly what we're going to break down. So here's our game plan. We'll start with a quick overview, the big picture. Then we'll zoom in on how the first cells get their jobs. We'll watch the functional units, these things called chorionic villi, grow and change. Then we'll check out the final mature structure. We'll also cover the surrounding membranes and wrap up with a look at what happens when this whole complex process goes sideways with a condition called preeclampsia.
Okay, let's jump right in. Before we get lost in the weeds of how this thing is built, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about what the placenta is and what its main parts are. At its heart, the placenta is like the ultimate border checkpoint. Its main job is exchange. Good stuff like nutrients and oxygen go in, waste products like carbon dioxide go out. But here's the really mind-blowing part. It has a dual origin. Part of it is fetal, coming from something called the chorion frondosum, and frondosum means leafy or bushy, which will make perfect sense in a bit. The other part is maternal, from the lining of the uterus called the decidua bassalis. It's a true joint venture. Now this diagram shows the real magic, doesn't it? You've got two completely separate circulatory systems working side by side, but the blood never actually mixes. You see the fetal vessels branching out into these incredible tree-like structures, the villi. And these villi are just dangling in pools of the mother's blood. This whole setup creates a massive surface area, making that exchange super efficient. Okay, so we've seen the final product. Now let's rewind the clock all the way back to the beginning. We're talking about the second week of development, a ridiculously busy time where the blueprint for everything we just saw gets laid down at lightning speed. You got to appreciate how fast this all happens. Around day 8, the outer cell layer splits in two. You get an inner layer of single cells, the cytotrophoblast, and this outer monster of a layer, the syncytiotrophoblast. This outer layer is one giant cell with tons of nuclei, and it's built to invade. A day later, little spaces open up inside it. Then, the main event. Around day 12, this invasive layer literally chews its way into the mother's blood vessels. Maternal blood floods in, and bam, you have the very first, very basic uteroplacental circulation. Just one day after that, the inner cells start pushing out, forming the first little nubs, the primary villi. All right, so we've got these little primary villi, but they're just simple stubs of cells. The next phase is all about a major upgrade, transforming them from simple bumps into the high-tech functional units that can actually support a growing embryo. Here in image A, you can see that primary villus we were just talking about. It's super simple, just a core of cytotrophoblast cells with that syncytial layer wrapped around it. Think of it as the basic scaffolding. It's the framework that everything else is going to be built on. Now check out the change in B. A new player enters the game. This supportive tissue, the mesoderm, pushes its way right into the core of the villus. And just like that, we've upgraded to a secondary villus. It's now a 3-layer structure. The syncytiotrophoblast on the outside, cytotrophoblast in the middle, and this new mesodermal core. And finally, the last evolution, the tertiary villus, which you can see right here in C. This is the real deal, the fully functional version. Why? Because that mesoderm in the core doesn't just sit there. It starts forming actual blood vessels, creating a whole capillary network right inside the villus. This is the absolute game changer, because now blood can flow through the villi. And the timing of this is just perfect. This brand new network of pipes inside the villi hooks up with vessels that lead all the way back to the embryo through what will become the umbilical cord. So when that tiny little heart starts its first beats in the 4th week, the whole supply line is connected, primed, and ready to deliver all the oxygen and nutrients it's going to need. It's just incredible biological coordination. So, we've successfully built the functional units. Now let's zoom out and take a look at the finished architecture of the fully developed placenta and see how it continues to fine-tune itself to become even more efficient over time. For any exchange to be efficient, you want as few barriers as possible, right? Well, early on, at 4 weeks, a single molecule of oxygen has to cross 4 different layers to get from mom to baby. It's like going through 4 security checkpoints. But check out the incredible change by the 4th month. The body streamlines the whole process. 2 of those layers just get out of the way, leaving only 2. This thinning makes transport way more efficient, which is absolutely critical for the baby's massive growth spurt. This image gives us a fantastic bird's eye view of the whole setup. You've got the fetal side, the chorionic plate on top. Coming off of that are these big tree trunks, the stem villi. They branch and branch into smaller and smaller limbs until you get these tiny, delicate leaves, the terminal villi. And this entire forest is just floating in that big lake of maternal blood. What an amazing design. Now, some of those big tree trunks have a very special job. These are the anchoring villi. And just like their name suggests, they grow all the way across that space and physically bolt the fetal side of the placenta to the mother's uterine wall. They are the roots that hold the whole thing securely in place. And then you have the terminal villi.
If the anchoring villi are the roots, these guys are the leaves of the tree. They are the thousands of tiny, free-floating branches that do all the heavy lifting. They have a massive surface area, and it's right here, across their super thin walls, that all the groceries get delivered and all the trash gets picked up. This is where the action is.
So the placenta is amazing, but it's not forming in a vacuum. The membranes around the embryo are also going through some pretty dramatic changes. Let's take a look at how the neighborhood gets organized, specifically the chorion and the decidua.
In the very early weeks, villi cover the entire outside of the chorionic sac, kind of like a fuzzy tennis ball. But the body is super efficient. It realizes it only needs those villi on the side that's digging into the uterus, so it does some landscaping. The villi on the business end grow like crazy, becoming that bushy, leafy chorion frontosum. And the villi on the other side, they get trimmed back and disappear, leaving a totally smooth surface.
At the same time, the mother's uterine lining, the decidua, is also specializing. The chunk right under the placenta becomes the decidua basalis. That's the maternal contribution. The part stretched over the rest of the growing baby is the decidua capsularis. As the baby gets bigger and bigger, that capsularis layer gets stretched so thin that it eventually just fades away. That allows the smooth part of the chorion to press up against the rest of the uterine wall and fuse with it until the growing baby fills the entire space.
Okay, we've gone through this beautiful, complex developmental dance. But it's so important to understand every step, because when this process fails, the consequences can be really severe. And that brings us to our clinical focus, preeclampsia. This comparison says it all. Look at image A. In a normal pregnancy, those cytotrophoblast cells are like expert demolition crews. They invade the mother's arteries and completely remodel them, ripping out the muscular walls and turning them into massive, wide-open channels that can gush blood to the placenta. But in preeclampsia, shown in B, that remodeling job is incomplete. The arteries stay narrow and tight, and that chokes off the blood flow. So when you trace it all back, preeclampsia is fundamentally a problem with the trophoblast. It starts with those cells back in week 2 not doing their job right. Because the placenta is starved for blood, it sends out signals that cause the mother's blood pressure to skyrocket. That's the hypertension. That high pressure then damages her own organs, like the kidneys, causing protein to leak into the urine. It happens in about 5% of pregnancies, and it's a serious risk, not just for the mother, but also for the baby, who just isn't getting the blood supply needed to grow properly. When you follow the entire story, from those first cells differentiating on day 8 all the way to this complex, life-sustaining organ, you just have to be in awe. It's an absolute marvel of biological engineering. Its development is a cascade of perfectly timed events that sets the stage for the next 9 months, which really leaves you with a final thought. Seeing how an issue like preeclampsia has its roots so early on, how does this whole process really hammer home just how critically important those first few weeks are for the health of an entire pregnancy?
All right, welcome. In this explainer, we are diving deep into the fetal membranes and the placenta. Think of it as the all-in-one life support system for a developing fetus. For anyone in medical school, really getting a handle on these structures is absolutely crucial. So let's get right into it.
So here's our game plan for today. We'll kick things off with the full-term placenta, then get into placental circulation and its many functions. After that, we'll look at the amnion and the umbilical cord and the amniotic fluid. Then we'll touch on some key clinical correlates, and we'll finish up with the fascinating embryology of twinning. Okay, let's jump into part 1, the full-term placenta. Now, it might seem a little backwards, but we're actually going to start at the finish line, the end of pregnancy, to really understand the final anatomy of this incredible organ. Take a look at this. It really is a tale of two sides, isn't it? On the left, you've got the fetal side, which is all smooth and shiny because it's covered by the amnion. But then you look over at the maternal side on the right, and it's a totally different story. It's rough, it's kind of spongy, and it's divided into these bumpy sections we're about to talk about.
So let's put some numbers on this. At full term, the placenta is shaped like a disc. It's about 15 to 25 centimeters across, 3 centimeters thick, and weighs around half a kilogram. And that last point is key. The maternal side is broken up into 15 to 20 lobes called cotyledons. These are basically the core functional units of the whole operation.
This diagram really brings it all together. Let's look at figure A, the fetal side. You can clearly see the amnion covering the chorionic plate, and you can see all those big vessels spreading out from the umbilical cord. Now flip over to figure B, the maternal side. Each one of those segments is a cotyledon, and the grooves you see between them, those are formed by decidual septa, which are just partitions of maternal tissue that help keep everything organized. All right, part 2. Now that we've got the anatomy down, let's talk about how this thing actually works. We're looking at placental circulation and function. This is the dynamic engine that drives all nutrient and gas exchange. Okay, this diagram right here, this is absolutely fundamental. You're looking at two completely separate circulatory systems working side by side. Maternal blood comes in and pools in these open areas called intervillous spaces. It basically bathes these finger-like fetal villi. Inside those villi, you have fetal capillaries carrying deoxygenated blood. And right across that thin membrane is where all the magic happens: gas exchange, nutrient exchange. Then, the freshly oxygenated blood heads back to the fetus. But here is the most important takeaway, the one you absolutely have to remember. Maternal and fetal blood never, ever mix. The efficiency of this system is just mind-blowing. I mean, think about these numbers for a second. You have 80 to 100 maternal arteries feeding a space that holds only about 150 milliliters of blood. But get this, that entire volume is replaced 3 to 4 times every single minute. And the total surface area for exchange? It's massive, up to 14 square meters. We're talking about the size of a small bedroom, all packed into this one organ.
So, because of this incredible exchange system, the placenta is like the ultimate multi-tool for the fetus. It acts as a whole bunch of organs all at once. It's the lungs for gas exchange, the gut for nutrients, and the kidneys for waste removal. It also provides passive immunity by shuttling mom's antibodies across. And on top of all that, it's a powerful endocrine gland. It pumps out hormones like HCG, progesterone, and estrogen. And it makes one called somatomammotropin, which is really clever. It actually makes the mother a little bit insulin resistant. This keeps her blood sugar slightly higher, making sure the fetus gets a constant prioritized supply of energy. Pretty amazing, right?
Okay, let's move on to part 3 and zoom in on the supporting cast, the amnion and the umbilical cord. This is the protective bubble and the vital lifeline that connects everything together. Let's rewind the clock to about the 5th week of development. What we're looking at here is the primitive umbilical ring. You can think of it as this busy little hub or doorway between the amnion and the embryo. And passing through it, you have the connecting stalk, which holds the umbilical vessels and the allantois. You've got the yolk stalk with its own vessels, and a little canal connecting everything. So how do we get from that busy little hub to the simple cord we all recognize? Well, this timeline lays it out. As the amniotic cavity gets bigger and bigger, it basically envelops and squeezes the connecting stalk and the yolk stalk together, forming the primitive cord. By the end of the 3rd month, the amnion has expanded so much that it fuses with the chorion, getting rid of that chorionic cavity. And eventually, a lot of those early structures, like the yolk sac, just regress and disappear, leaving us with just the umbilical vessels, all protected inside this amazing gelatinous stuff called Wharton's jelly. And here is the finished product. The cross-section on the left shows that classic arrangement: 2 thick-walled umbilical arteries and 1 larger thin-walled umbilical vein. And here's the key thing to remember. Arteries carry blood away from the fetus, so that's deoxygenated blood, while the one big vein carries all the good stuff, the oxygenated blood, to the fetus. And all 3 vessels are nicely cushioned by that Wharton's jelly you see all around them. Next up, part 4. Let's talk about the world the fetus actually lives in, the amniotic fluid. And we'll also touch on how the placenta itself changes as pregnancy comes to an end. So amniotic fluid is this clear, watery substance that mostly comes from maternal blood. It grows from just a little bit to almost a full liter term. And its job is super important. It's a shock absorber, it stops the fetus from sticking to the amnion, and it gives the fetus room to move around, which is essential for muscle and bone development. And this is wild. The entire volume is completely recycled every 3 hours. The fetus is a big part of that process. It swallows about 400 milliliters a day, and starting around the 5th month, it also starts contributing its own urine to the mix. You know, nothing lasts forever, and that includes the placenta. As pregnancy nears the end, the placenta starts to age, and its efficiency can decrease a bit. You start to see more fibrous tissue, kind of like scar tissue. The walls of the fetal capillaries get thicker, and some of the really small capillaries even get closed off. And you can get this protein-based material called fibrinoid deposited on the villi, which can slow down that exchange process. Now for part 5, and this is where the rubber really meets the road for clinical practice. We're going to talk about some common clinical correlates. What happens when this development doesn't go quite according to plan? A classic textbook example is hemolytic disease of the newborn. This can happen when an Rh-negative mother has an Rh-positive fetus. During the first pregnancy, it's usually fine. But at delivery, a little fetal blood can mix with the mom's circulation. Her immune system sees the Rh factor as foreign and builds antibodies. Now, if she has another pregnancy with an Rh-positive baby, those antibodies she made can cross the placenta and attack the new fetus's red blood cells. This causes severe anemia and a dangerous condition called fetal hydrops. It's exactly why we screen for this.
This slide shows the really devastating effects of something called amniotic band syndrome. What happens here is that the amnion, that inner membrane, can tear. When it does, it can create these fibrous string-like bands that just float around in the fluid. And if one of those bands happens to wrap around a fetal limb or a finger or a toe, it can act like a tourniquet, leading to deep constrictions or, in the worst cases, even in utero amputation. When it comes to amniotic fluid, you're really looking for that just right amount. Too much or too little can be a sign that something's wrong. On one side, you have hydramnios, or polyhydramnios, which is too much fluid. That can be linked to things like maternal diabetes or fetal issues that prevent swallowing. On the flip side, you have oligohydramnios, which is not enough fluid. A major cause here is renal agenesis. If the fetus's kidneys don't develop, it's not producing urine and the fluid level plummets. This can lead to serious problems like fetal constriction and underdeveloped lungs. And for our final section, we're diving into something truly fascinating, the embryology of twinning. So what's the deal? How do you get twins? Does it start from one fertilization or two? Let's find out. First up, let's talk about dizygotic or fraternal twins. This is the more common type, and the mechanism is pretty straightforward. Two separate eggs are ovulated and then fertilized by two different sperm. The key takeaway is that genetically they're no more alike than any other siblings. And as you can see here, they each set up their own independent households, with their own placenta, their own amnion, and their own chorionic sac. Now for monozygotic or identical twins. This is where it gets a little more complex, because they all start from a single fertilized egg that splits in two. And the most crucial factor here is timing. When that split occurs determines everything about their setup and potential clinical risks. Let's walk through the three main scenarios. In scenario A, the split happens super early, at the two-cell stage. The twins end up with separate placentas and sacs, looking just like fraternal twins. This is the safest arrangement. Scenario B is the most common. The split happens a bit later in the inner cell mass. The result is a shared placenta and chorion, but they each get their own separate amniotic sac. Finally, in scenario C, the split happens very late. In this case, the twins share everything: one placenta, one chorion, and one amniotic sac. And this arrangement carries the highest risk for complications, like their umbilical cords getting tangled. So let's just end with this thought. The placenta is a temporary, disposable organ. And yet, for 9 months, it performs the functions of multiple adult organ systems with just breathtaking efficiency. So what does its incredible complexity tell us about the absolute priorities of early human development? It's really a testament to an elegant and robust design that's completely focused on ensuring our survival and growth during our most vulnerable stage of life.
All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're talking about birth defects. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is core textbook stuff. But honestly, understanding why these congenital abnormalities happen goes way beyond just passing your exams. This is one of those topics that's absolutely fundamental for any clinician. So let's dive in and really unpack it.
Okay, so here's what we've got on the agenda. We'll kick things off with an introduction to birth defects. Then, we'll get into how to classify structural abnormalities. After that, we'll look at the etiology, the causes. We'll spend some time on the principles of teratology, which is super important. And finally, we'll wrap up with the methods of prenatal diagnosis.
All right, let's jump into our first section, an introduction to birth defects. We're going to define the scope here and really get a sense of the significance of what we're talking about.
So first things first, let's get our language right. You're going to hear a few different terms, like birth defect, congenital malformation, or a congenital anomaly. The thing is, they all mean the same thing. They're just umbrella terms for any kind of structural, behavioral, or functional issue that's present at birth. And the field that studies all of this, that's teratogenealogy.
You might be wondering, okay, how common is this really? Well, about 2 to 3% of newborns have major structural anomalies. But wait, that number is a little misleading. Because you see, another 2 to 3% of these defects aren't even picked up until a child is about 5 years old. So when you add it all up, the real number is actually closer to 6%. It's more common than you might think.
And this right here is why this topic is so incredibly important. Get this, birth defects are the #1 cause of infant mortality. They account for about 21% of all infant deaths.
That is a huge number, and it just underscores how critical it is for us, as clinicians, to understand these conditions.
So, what's behind all this? Is it genetics, or is it the environment? Well, the answer is, it's complicated. It's really tempting to point the finger at just one or the other, but the vast majority of the time, that's not the case. Look at this. A full 55% of congenital abnormalities are multifactorial. What does that mean? It means it's a complex dance, a super intricate interaction between a person's genes and their environment.
Okay, so we've established the causes are complex. Now let's shift gears and talk about the different types of structural problems we see. We're going to break them down into 3 key categories: malformations, disruptions, and deformations. And trust me, getting these definitions straight is absolutely key for diagnosis. First up, we have malformations. Think of this as a problem with the original blueprint. The developmental process itself is intrinsically abnormal, right from the get-go. This usually happens during organogenesis, when all those organs are first forming. A really striking, though thankfully rare, example is cyanomelia, sometimes called mermaid syndrome, where a fundamental error in early development leads to the legs being fused.
All right, next up are disruptions. And this is a totally different ballgame. With a disruption, the blueprint was perfect. The organ or structure started forming just fine, but then something came along and, well, disrupted it. It's a destructive process that messes up a structure that was already formed. So it's not a faulty blueprint. It's more like an accident on the construction site.
Let me give you a couple of classic examples so this really clicks. Imagine a vascular accident. Say the blood supply to a piece of the developing intestine gets cut off. That can cause that part of the intestine to die, leading to what we call intestinal atresia. Another great example is amniotic bands. These are fibrous strands that can peel away from the amniotic sac and, well, they can wrap around a limb or even the face. They act like a tourniquet, cutting off blood flow and causing some serious damage, sometimes even leading to things like a cleft lip. And that brings us to our third category, deformations. Now with these, both the blueprint and the construction were perfectly fine. The problem here is mechanical. A body part that developed normally gets pushed or molded into an odd shape because of prolonged physical forces, usually from being cramped inside the uterus. Think of it like a clay sculpture getting squished before it has a chance to harden.
And here's a perfect visual for that. Club feet, a classic example of a deformation. One of the most common causes is something called oligohydramnios, which just means there isn't enough amniotic fluid. Less fluid means less space, so the fetus is cramped, and the feet can get pressed into this abnormal position. But here's the really important part. Because the underlying bones and muscles developed normally, the prognosis for deformations like this is often excellent. They can usually be corrected after birth.
Okay, this is a super important clinical pearl. Sometimes the smallest, most minor anomalies can be red flags for a much bigger underlying problem. We're talking about things like low-set ears or a single crease in the palm, things that might seem insignificant by themselves. But look at the pattern here. An infant with just one minor anomaly has about a 3% risk of a major defect. But if they have 2, the risk jumps to 10%. And with 3 or more, it skyrockets to 20%. This is exactly why a detailed newborn exam is so critical. You have to look for these patterns.
So, we've covered how to classify these issues. Now let's dig a little deeper into Section 3 and talk about etiology. What's actually causing them? As we mentioned before, the causes really boil down to 3 main buckets. You've got your purely genetic factors, like chromosomal abnormalities. Then you have environmental factors, which we call teratogens. And then there's that big one in the middle, multifactorial inheritance. That's that complex gene-environment interaction we talked about.
This is a great lead into our next section, which is all about the principles of teratogenology. These are basically the ground rules for how environmental substances, teratogens, can cause problems during development. This is really foundational stuff.
Okay, so there are 5 main principles you've got to know. First, susceptibility depends on the genotype of both the mother and the embryo. Genes matter. Second, and I can't stress this enough, susceptibility changes with the developmental stage. Basically, timing is everything. Third, the dose and duration of exposure make a big difference. Fourth, teratogens work through specific mechanisms to cause problems. And finally, the outcome isn't always a crazy malformation. It can be death, growth retardation, or a functional disorder.
Let's really zoom in on that second principle, the timing, because it is absolutely crucial. In the first couple of weeks, you're looking at an all or none law. A major insult will either kill the embryo or will likely recover completely without any defects.
But then you hit the embryonic period, from week 3 to week 8. This is the peak danger zone. This is when organogenesis is in full swing and the embryo is incredibly vulnerable to major structural defects. After that, in the fetal period from week 9 on, the susceptibility shifts. Exposure then is more likely to cause functional issues, like problems with brain development or just slow down overall growth.
Okay, so we've talked about what these defects are, how to classify them, and what causes them. So now for the big question, how do we actually find them? That takes us to our last section, the methods of prenatal diagnosis we use to identify these problems in utero.
When it comes to prenatal diagnosis, we have a pretty amazing toolkit these days. We've got things like ultrasound, which is non-invasive and gives us a literal window into the womb. There's also maternal serum screening, which is a simple blood test. And then, for more definitive answers, we have more invasive procedures like amniocentesis and chorionic villus sampling, which let us get a direct look at the fetal genetics.
And the whole point of using these techniques is to look for everything we've just been talking about. We use them to see structural malformations, to check for genetic problems, to make sure the fetus is growing properly, basically to spot any potential complications. This is where all that embryology knowledge becomes real, actionable, clinical information.
And I want to leave you with this one really powerful thought. Our ability to diagnose these problems so early has completely changed the game. It's opened the door to in utero therapies, treating problems before the baby is even born. And that leads to this quote, which really says it all. The use and development of in utero therapies have heralded a new concept in which the fetus is now a patient. Just think about that. The fetus is now a patient. That's a massive shift in thinking, moving us from just diagnosing to actively treating. And that right there is the future of this incredible field.